Can you rate the progress that the Paris Agreement has delivered since COP21 on a scale of 1 to 10, and why you think this?
Well, I would say there's very little progress because there's no reductions in global emissions of carbon dioxide. And if you look at the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and methane in the atmosphere, it's actually growing more rapidly than it was 2 years ago. Partly.
Was this something you thought would happen then, or saw happening?
Well, I thought what would happen as a result of the Paris Agreement was very little. It's analogous to the Kyoto Protocol. There, politicians agreed that climate was a problem and nations would try to reduce their emissions. In fact, emissions accelerated. The rate of growth increased. And if you look at developed countries, their emissions peaked in 1980 and since then have been flat. There's no evidence of an impact of the Kyoto Protocol or the Framework Convention in the 1990s. Now we got to 2015, we have the Paris Protocol, all the politicians clapping each other on the back as if something had been accomplished. But there's not going to be any reduction in fossil fuel use as long as fossil fuels are the cheapest energy. And that's the situation. We have to make fossil fuels include the cost to society. That means the air pollution cost, the water pollution cost, the climate change cost. So we have to add a carbon fee or a carbon tax, which has to be across the board, oil, gas, and coal, not some cap and trade gimmick which does almost nothing. So there's no realization of the politicians that they have not taken the needed actions. So in that sense, there's been no progress.
Do you have dialogue with leading figures from the UNFCCC or government officials? And have you had any replies to your previous criticisms?
Well, I have gone to different countries and tried to make this case. And, they do not really change their approach. I try to persuade them, cap and trade with offsets is really not doing anything. And they have to admit that. I met with the science advisor to the European Commissioner. She agreed, cap and trade is not working, and what you need is an across-the-board rising carbon tax or carbon fee. But she says you have to persuade them, the bureaucrats in in Brussels. Well, that's hard to do because there are all these deals, and that as yet, these politicians are working more for the fossil fuel industry than they are for the public, in my opinion.
So when you see words like ambition, which is a word that's very tight, how do you interpret that, and what do you think of it?
Well, that's just a hoax, in my opinion. They say that they're going to try to do something. It won't work as long as fossil fuels are allowed to be the cheapest energy. Somebody will burn them. So some countries will try real hard and they'll reduce their emissions 20% or 30%. But look at the global emissions. They're still staying at least the same, if not increasing. And that's going to be true as long as fossil fuels are allowed to be the cheapest energy.
So could you, in a very sort of, it's almost like an elevator pitch, but summarize what you would prescribe as a course of action?
Yeah, the course of action should be to collect a fee from the fossil fuel companies at the domestic mines and the ports of entry, and give the money to the public, an equal amount to all legal residents. That way, the person who does better than average in limiting their carbon footprint will make money. In fact, if you look at the distribution of energy use by the public, about 70% of the people could make money with the present distribution. Wealthy people would lose money, but they can afford that. They have a bigger carbon footprint because they travel more and have bigger houses. But this would be a big incentive for people to pay attention to what they're buying. As the carbon fee rises, products that are made with fossil fuels, with more fossil fuels, will become more expensive. So people will tend to buy other products. And this will move us off of fossil fuels. Economists all agree this is the way to do it. Let the market help you solve the problem. You can't do it by regulations by subsidizing solar panels. It does very little good. We're getting less than 1% of global energy from solar panels.
When you look across the political spectrum, let's say today, and maybe it'll get better in terms of the US situation and so on, do you feel that we could go in the direction that you're prescribing? I mean, from
I think yes, I think we will go in that direction because China will eventually go in that direction. They're already beginning to have internal carbon price and carbon tax, and they have a few 100 million people living near sea level. They do not deny the science. They understand it. And they want to go to clean energies because their air pollution is so bad. So they're going to move in that direction, and as their economy continues to grow relative to the rest of the world, they may be in a position that they could virtually impose this. You see, either the United States or China or the European Union needs to decide we're going to have a carbon fee or carbon tax. None of them have done that yet. But if just one of them would do it, they could practically impose it by means of border duties on products from countries that do not have an equivalent carbon fee. And that's then a big incentive for other countries to have their own carbon fee so they can collect the money themselves. The World Trade Organization agrees that such a border duty would be justified, and that's what we need. But we haven't got any of those three major economic powers to agree to do it yet.
Yeah. Why is this view not being considered as part of the roadmap to 1.5, 2 degrees?
Well, the reason that we're not doing what every economist says we should do, have a carbon tax, is that the fossil fuel industry is too damn powerful in capitals all around the world, in Washington, D.C. and in other capitals. I thought the U.S. was worse than the rest of the world, and in some ways at the moment it is. But I went to about a dozen countries, and I found that the fossil fuel industry is very powerful in every capital.
Okay. So are you hopeful that we will turn this climate issue around?
Yeah, I think we will turn it around, but we had better do it pretty soon, because the fundamental difficulty is the delayed response of the climate system. We've only witnessed about half of the change for the gases that are already in the atmosphere. Just because the ocean has so much inertia, it doesn't warm up quickly. There's more energy coming in to the planet than going out, and therefore the ocean is going to continue to warm up even if we stabilized atmospheric CO2 today. And then the ice sheets also have great inertia. So they're beginning to melt, but sea level is only going up at a rate that, if continued 100 years, is only so much. But it's doubled, that rate has doubled a few times in the last 150 years. And if it doubles a few more times, then you're talking about meters. And we would lose all coastal cities if we stay on that path. So we really need to begin to stabilize atmospheric composition, and that means reduce fossil fuel use rapidly over the next few decades. We should be off of fossil fuels by the middle of the century if we want to stabilize climate.
But even if we stabilize, what you're saying is we're still going to see the impacts
of
what we've done.
Well, if we would reduce emissions a few percent a year, which economists say you could easily do if you had a rising price on carbon, then the maximum temperature rise would be about 1.5 degrees. It's already a little more than 1 degree. And it would still go up for a few decades, but it would peak at about 1.5 and then could begin to go down. We would also, in addition to reducing emissions a few percent a year, need to store more carbon in the soil and biosphere. But that's possible, and it has other advantages. With improved agricultural and forestry practices, the soil can contain more carbon and become more fertile in the process. And there's value in forests also, in reforestation. So we can do that.
So this is a hope story in a way.
It's a plausible. The economic studies show that if you had a reasonable rising carbon fee, that emissions would go down by a few percent a year. So it's feasible, but not without a carbon price.